The shot cracked the afternoon wide open. Sheriff Kane's Colt barked once, and Eli Mercer, his boyhood friend, the man who had stood at Kane's wedding and dug his son's grave beside him, staggered backward into the sun. Dust lifted in slow spirals around Eli's boots. His hat slipped off, brim catching a brief blade of light before it fell. Behind him, Cedar Bluff's main street froze. Poker hands suspended midair inside the saloon, a milk pail clattering from a child's fingers, the church bell's rope swaying but silent. The smell of gun oil and hot dust mingled with the sharp copper tang of blood. Kane held still, both hands on the pearl handle, smoke unwinding from the muzzle like a promise. His silver badge gleamed against his black duster, catching a mote of sun that made it flash like a signal no one could misread. He heard nothing at first, but the ringing in his ears, a pale, high shriek, like wind through winter wire. Eli's knees buckled. He went down slow, as though each inch of sky above him had to be surrendered on purpose. "Kane," he rasped, hand worrying at his vest like he'd lost something in the lining. The word broke in half. Blood bubbled at his lips. Somebody finally found a voice. "Sweet Lord," the blacksmith breathed. He shot Eli. A woman screamed. A man barked, "Murder!" Boots scuffed. Chair legs dragged. Then the whole street exhaled at once, a heat haze of anger, fear, and curiosity rolling toward the center where Kane stood. He lowered the Colt, reholstered by instinct. His fingers shook barely. He stilled them by spinning the badge once, twice, the edge rasping his callus. "Law ain't always justice," he said, not loudly but enough. "But justice rides with me." The words salted the air. Deputy Holt shouldered through the crowd, a thin, ferret-eyed man with a widow's peak and a uniform that always looked borrowed. He stopped just short of Eli's boots, gaze flicking from the hole blooming in Eli's shirt to the calm iron in Kane's posture. "Holster that iron," Holt snapped out of habit, even though it was already done. Then more uncertain, "What in blazes happened here, Sheriff?" Kane didn't answer. He knelt, the leather of his coat creaking softly, and slid a palm beneath Eli's head. Eli's breath hitched, the old sweetgrass smell of his hair oil mixed with dust and blood, familiar and wrong together. Close up, Kane could see the tremor in his friend's lip, the glass fleck of sun on a tear that had nowhere to go. "You drew first," Kane said, quiet enough for only Eli to hear. "In front of a child, you made me do this." Eli blinked him into focus. There was a flicker of something like apology, then fear, then stubborn pride, the kind that had gotten them both whipped behind the livery at 15. His fingers scrabbled at his vest again, finally hooking a thumb into the lining and tearing it. A small, leather-bound book showed its edge, grease-dark, corner softened by years of touching. Eli held it like a last sacrament. "Don't let them have it," he whispered, cellar above the false floor. A ragged cough. "It wasn't supposed to touch you." Kane's mouth went dry. He bent closer. "What secret do I drag you to hell with, Eli?" Eli tried to smile, and failed. Blood purled in the corner of his mouth, the same one that took Anna and the boy. His eyes slid toward the churchyard, toward the twin stones no one dared mention around Kane. Panic flared in them, quick as a struck match. His hand tightened on the little book. "They'll kill you for it, partner. Whatever he meant to say drowned under the town's rising voices. Holt had turned to the crowd and to duty. Both made him louder. "Everyone back," The deputy barked, doing what men do when they don't know what else to do. Back from the bodies. Bodies. Plural. As if Kane had put half the street down. Kane stood slowly, his knees popping. He wanted to pull Eli up from the dirt, restore breath and banter and cheap whiskey jokes. Instead, he stepped back and let the neighbor he trusted least read the scene with a fool's eyes. Eli, Kane said. The name left his mouth like it had weight. He swallowed it back down. I warned you. A month earlier, no, an hour, 10 minutes. Time felt like a rawhide thong pulled too tight, and then snapped. Kane had walked out of the jailhouse into this same sun. The gallows beyond the courthouse, dry cedar beams, rope coiled neat, threw a stunted noose of shadow across the square. He'd found Eli on the boardwalk, scuffing a boot heel like he used to when he'd done wrong, and hadn't decided whether to lie. Kane, Eli had said, and the old warmth in it stumbled. We got to talk, you and me. Kane had studied him, the careful part in his hair, the new coat he hadn't had last week, the sick way his eyes refused to meet the churchyard, and the way he kept a hand tucked over his heart like a man guarding pain or something he'd put there. Talk then, Kane had told him. Plain. Eli had swallowed. Sometimes men get cornered. Sometimes there's more than one way to keep wolves off a town. Sometimes you take coin you shouldn't, because taking it means the shooting stops. The shooting didn't stop, Kane had said. The breeze had shifted, and in it, Kane had smelled horses that weren't town horses. Cold iron, the sour ink reek of fresh ledgers. It moved to my house. Eli's face had gone pale. Kane, I swear by... Swear quiet, Kane had said, and put your hand where I can see it. And that was when the little boy had stepped from behind Eli, the blacksmith's son, a wheat-haired colt of a child, with something glinting caught in both hands, a pocket derringer, lady-sized and deadly. The boy had blinked up into the sun and into the argument. Eli had spun, fast, too fast, and too practiced, and snatched the gun from the child. He'd turned back toward the sheriff like he meant to hand it over, but his thumb found the hammer. His eyes found Kane's, and the hammer came back. That was the moment, the irreversible one. Kane had seen the angle of Eli's wrist. The tightness in his mouth that meant pride would outrun sense. He'd seen the boy's small hand still reaching, empty now and confused. He'd felt the gallows shadow slide a degree along the boardwalk. And then Kane had done the thing he'd spend the rest of his life measuring himself against. Now the echo of it faded from the facades, and the dust settled. Eli's chest hitched twice and stopped. By God, Sheriff, Holt said, voice shaking between accusation and awe. You gunned your own friend down cold. He reached for a trigger with a child in the line. Kane replied, the words as dry as trail bread. You would have missed. I didn't. Man draws, a man falls. Someone muttered. That's the law. Ain't the whole of it, the blacksmith said back, low. Not when it's Kane. Not when it's Eli. Holt licked his lips. Duty had to go somewhere, so he set it on the nearest altar. Hand over your sidearm, Sheriff, while we sort. Kane's eyes cut to him. Steel gray. Quiet. No. A hush. Holt flushed. I'll wire the territorial office, he blurted, retreating into procedure. Marshal Delaney will want... Kane let the name hang. He knew Delaney by reputation, a badge with politics for a spine. Authority dressed up like justice and able to hang a man for looking at the wrong ledger. He felt the weight of Eli's half-torn vest lining against his palm and made a choice most men call arrogance, and he calls survival. With 2 fingers, he tugged the little leather book free. Holt took a step forward. "Evidence?" he said, too fast. Kane palmed the book into his duster, where the fabric lay against the heat of his ribs. It felt like a hot stone, like a sin, or a key. "You think shooting your friend buys you the right to keep secrets?" Holt's voice rose. "That's not law." Kane's badge spun once more between finger and thumb, the sun glancing off it into Holt's eyes. Maybe not, but it might be justice. He turned then, because he couldn't look at Eli anymore without seeing a boy barebacking a swayback mare into the creek, laughing like the world would never harden. The townsfolk parted the way grass parts for fire. Some spit into the dust. Some crossed themselves. Most stared, eyes bright, with the kind of hunger that only comes when a giant learns he can bleed. The telegraph began tapping from inside the office, urgent and staccato, as if the wire itself had felt the gunshot. The operator, thin, nervous, fumbled out with a yellow slip, eyes wider than saucers. He almost tripped on Eli's boot. "From Santa Lucia," he stammered, looking anywhere but at the body. "For Deputy Holt, from Marshal Delaney's desk." Holt snatched it, throat working as he read. His face went the color of sour milk. He read it again, then up at Kane, something like calculation, as ugly as a snake's crawl, looking for a foothold. "What is it?" the blacksmith asked. Holt was suddenly brave with paper in his hand. He lifted his chin. "By order of the territorial marshal," he said, voice pitched to carry to the last porch rail, "Sheriff Carter Kane is to be relieved of duty pending inquiry into the murder of Eli Mercer. Hold him. Hold whatever he's holding." Kane didn't move. He only felt the little book burn hotter against his chest, and heard, far off, the gallows rope creak as the breeze toyed with it, like a whisper in an empty throat. And then from Eli's lifeless hand, something slid free. A folded scrap he'd torn loose before he fell. It landed at Kane's boot. A smeared brand mark stamped the paper, a cattle head split by a lightning bolt. Kane knew that brand the way a man knows the shape of his own scar. It was carved on the fence post, outside the house, that burned the night his family died. The crowd's breath sucked in as one. Holt reached, swift as a pickpocket. So did Kane. Their fingers met over the paper and froze. "Sheriff," Holt said, smiling with his teeth and not his eyes, "you going to make this easy, or are we going to find out how much rope Cedar Bluff's got left?" Kane let the crowd's noise wash over him like heat off a forge. He stood in the middle of Main Street with Eli dead in the dust and the gallows' stubby shadow crawling across the square. Holt held the telegraph slip high, voice pitched to carry. "By order of Marshal Delaney, Sheriff Carter Kane is relieved of duty, pending inquiry for the murder of Eli Mercer." Murmurs tilted into shouts. A hat sailed. A bottle shattered. The blacksmith stepped forward, broad as a barn door, eyes cut with worry. Beside his leg, his wheat-haired boy clutched his empty little hand where the derringer had been minutes ago. Kane lifted his hands, palms open. His badge spun once between finger and thumb, catching the sun, catching breath. Then he pinned it flat to his chest, like a nail through a moth. "You want to keep blood off the boardwalk, Holt?" he said, voice low as a saw. "Then open the jailhouse and I'll walk myself in." Holt blinked, surprised by the easy surrender. He jerked his chin toward the brick building under the telegraph line. "Move, then." Kane stepped, boots on plank, eyes drilling holes in his spine, some hateful, some hungry for any kind of spectacle. As he passed the blacksmith's boy, he felt a small body drift like a minnow in the current of legs until it touched his coat. The boy's whisper barely stirred the dust. "Mr. Kane, I'm sorry." Kane didn't look down. "Ain't your fault, son," he said, and fed the boy the truth in a softer voice than he kept for men. "But I'm going to hand you a thing that don't belong to any man who wants me hanged. You keep it folded, and you keep it quiet. Take it to the old courthouse. North door is still unbarred. Put it under the third plank of the judge's dais. Can you do that?" The boy's swallow clicked. "Yes, sir." At the threshold of the jail, Kane turned as if to sweep his coat. In the motion, quick as a card trick and twice as careful, the little leather book slid from his palm into the boy's. A thumb-sized weight leaving, and a bigger one settling in his chest. Inside, the jail smelled of cold iron and old whiskey. His office, no, the office, was all angles. Desk scarred by years of elbows, bolted safe, caught behind bars with a ticking Bible stacked on it as if the good book could do time for a man. He set his Colt on the desk before Holt could order it. 3 clicks as he thumbed the cylinder empty, the sound neat as punctuation. "Keys," Holt said, throat tight. Kane picked his own ring off the peg where he'd hung it 100 nights and slid the bar to open the far cell. He stepped in. The door kissed shut, and the lock thumped like a slow heart. Outside the bars, Holt stood with his throat working. "Best friend," he muttered, "maybe to Kane, maybe to the cell itself, and you put a bullet in him." He reached for a trigger with a boy in the sight line. Kane sat on the cot. The bed wire creaked like a cricket. "You'd have missed. I didn't." Holt flushed. He started to say something hard, then looked away and found a different voice. "Delaney's coming. Sit quiet, and don't make me regret not roping you on the spot." Kane tipped his chin. "Fetch me water, then fetch the undertaker for Eli." When the deputy left, taking the wind with him, the jail fell to the soft sounds that always followed violence. A broom on planks, a sob like a bird in a chimney, the telegraph tapping toward some larger storm. Kane threaded his fingers through the bars and stared at the lamp's weak flame until it doubled in his eyes. The quiet lifted a lid on memory. Eli at 14, long-legged and mean to colts in the way of boys who would later be gentle with women. Eli at 19, laughing with a busted lip, the two of them stealing peaches they'd pay for with fence posts after. Eli standing at Kane's wedding, barefoot in the creek after the ceremony, trousers rolled, a bottle passed back and forth on a day white with joy. And another night, not a memory so much as a wound that never closed, smoke thick as wool, a scream choked by its own fire, a small wooden horse blackening, Anna's shoe on the stairs curled like a dead leaf. Out by the road, a cattle head split by a lightning bolt carved into a fence post, the cut edges bright as if done moments before. Split lightning. The brand had lived behind his eyes ever since. Some men drank their ghosts quiet. Kane never found liquor enough. Holt came back with a tin cup and a bucket. He set them so hard, water slopped. "Undertaker's with him," he said, not looking at Kane, and Ike Posey's already sharpening his gallows talk, in case the marshal says so. Kane's mouth twisted. Ike Posey ain't sharpened anything but his jaw in 20 years. He lifted the cup, rolled the cool rim against the sore edge of his tooth. "You're going to search my effects?" Holt bristled, grateful for a job. "By rights. Empty your coat." Kane shrugged out of the duster. It fell heavy on the cot, dust puffing like breath. He laid the contents on the cot: tobacco twist, flint, a coil of hemp line, a folded note from the black preacher who'd baptized his boy, and watched Holt's eyes snag on the last. The rough scrap he'd yanked from Eli's hand when they both reached, the one stamped with the split lightning brand. Holt flicked a glance at Kane. "Just a cow outfit's mark," the deputy said, too quickly. "Sure," Kane answered, "and just a rope is what they coil on the gallows." His smile was all knife. "You ever wonder why a cattle outfit's mark glowed on a post outside my house the night it burned?" Holt swallowed. He stuffed the scrap in his pocket, trying to look like a lawman and not like a man hiding a tell. "Delaney'll ask your questions." "Delaney'll bury them," Kane said, and the air changed in the room. Thicker, colder. He's the kind hangs answers before they can talk. Holt retreated to the desk, fumbling with the telegraph slip like the paper might fight back. He didn't see the blacksmith's boy ghost past the window, empty hands now, face hot, with a secret heavier than any derringer. When the jail went quiet again, Kane leaned back and let the iron smell of the cell fill his nose. He shut his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen to the past he'd shoved into the far stall of his mind. It came the way thunder does. First a long-distance rumble, then sudden and close. The ledger. He'd held Eli's little book long enough to feel it talk. He'd only seen the top page before he palmed it off. Tidy columns, dates like fence posts, sums marked not in dollars, but in candles and feed. Code. Men always thought code made them safe. But there'd been initials at the bottom of the last line, written with a proud hand. SL, not just split lightning. Something else, Sable and Lathrop, state line, or a man's name, Samuel Lawton, the merchant who smiled with all his teeth when cattle hands put coin on the counter. Eli had always hated arithmetic. Someone else had taught him the trick of keeping two ledgers, one for daylight, one for the night. Kane opened his eyes to the lamp's thin glow. "You owed me the truth, Eli," he said to the bars, "and I'll take it out of your ink if I can't take it out of your hide." A scrape. Boot leather outside the back door. Not Holt. This tread held polish and patience. Kane sat up. The lock turned with a care that said the hand on it didn't know this jail by touch. The door opened on a slender woman in a traveling dress the color of a midnight bruise. Veil, gloves, a posture that made the cheap room look like a parlor. She closed the door behind her with a click and slipped the bolt, then turned and lifted the veil. Her eyes were black coffee and sober. A faint scar notched her lip where a lady shouldn't have one. She glanced once toward the desk, where Holt snored lightly, hat tilted, telegraph slip under his cheek. "Mr. Kane," she whispered, voice schooling itself to no accent at all. "You don't know me. My name's Lila Gray." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small key and a folded paper. "I work accounts for Sable and Lathrop Freight. They use split lightning pens when they sign for deliveries in this county. That ledger you just palmed to the child, yes, I saw, will hang men if you can read it." Kane's pulse beat once in his throat, "And you walked into my cell at midnight to tell me charity news." She looked past him, through the bars, toward the Bible on the cot. "I walked in to say your friend didn't start as a thief. He started as a man paying a debt he couldn't bear. Then someone turned his debt into a chain." "Who?" Lila slid the paper between the bars. The lamp flame jittered when he took it. Ink bled the name like it hated the page. D. Delaney, for night candles, rendered. Paid in full. S&L, Cedar Bluff. A plank groaned outside. Not the back door this time. The boardwalk. Many boots. The soft murmur of men who didn't want to wake a town before they did violence in it. Lila's eyes flicked to the front window, where a shadow settled, broad-brimmed hat, star at the breast, the easy sway of a man both at home and at war in other people's rooms. Marshall, or something worse. Kane set the paper on the open Bible, squaring the edges like he did with trouble. He touched his badge with 2 fingers, steadying himself on the cold fact of it. Law ain't always justice, he said, quieter than he'd ever said it, making a promise to the iron and the night. But justice rides with me. The door latch dipped. Holt jolted awake, scrabbling for his pistol. The stranger's hand settled on the knob like a man lowering a coffin lid. And in that hushed fraction of a second before the door swung wide, Lila's breath brushed the bars. "If you want to live to read what Eli wrote," she murmured, "don't let him take you out the front." The door began to open. The star flashed. The room seemed to shrink to the space between Kane's fists, and the cell key she'd slid into his palm. The front door swung wide on polished hinges, and the star on the man's breast caught the lamplight like a wink from a hanging hook. Marshal Emmett Delaney stepped through the threshold with 2 men at his shoulders and a smile that never reached his eyes. Rain-dark hat, trimmed beard, boots buffed to a courthouse shine. Authority made flesh and oiled. Deputy Holt jerked upright from his half-sleep, hands scrambling for the pistol that had slid down his thigh. "Marshal," he blurted, relief and fear wrestling in his voice, "you got my wire." Delaney took off his hat as if the room were a parlor and not a box of iron. He let the silence get long enough to make the walls lean toward him. Then he glanced once at Kane behind the bars and once at Holt, measuring both men like a cattle buyer does teeth. "I did," he said softly, voice like leather bent over a knee. "And by thunder, I find my officer has placed a sheriff in his own cell and a good citizen dead in the street. A tangle." The smile showed again, thin as a straight razor. Behind the half-drawn veil of a pillar's shadow, Lila Gray stood still as an engraving, gloved hands at her waist, veil lowered. If Delaney saw her, he filed it away without a blink. Kane rose from the cot. The bedwire complained. Eli Mercer drew with a boy in the way. He said, "Even, bone calm, the kind of calm men who've seen their house burn wear like a habit." Delaney's gaze flicked to the empty peg where Kane's badge had hung 100 evenings. "And so you put a bullet through your best friend's heart. You reckon the town will swallow that neat?" "Swallowing's for men with no teeth left," Kane answered. "I'll chew it in the open, Marshal." Delaney chuckled as if good manners had been shown. "You'll have your chewing. Sundown, old courthouse, coroner's jury, proper and public." He turned his head, listening past the brick to the murmur outside. The tide of voices in Cedar Bluff, thinning and thickening as news moved from mouth to porch to street. "They're hungry for a spectacle, Holt," he observed. "Keep them hungry and you can lead them anywhere." Holt nodded too quickly. Delaney moved to the bars, near enough for Kane to smell the gentleman's cologne, fighting the ever-present iron. "You and I are of a mind on one point," he said low. "Law must be seen. Folks don't fear what they can't see, and fear keeps the rails straight." He smiled softer. "So we'll do this by the book. Out the front. The people will have their look." A whisper of cloth. Lila's breath touched the bars from the shadow's edge. "Don't let him take you out the front," she'd said minutes earlier. Now her gloved finger, a small movement no one else saw, tilted toward the back. A keys bite pressed cool against Kane's palm where she'd slid it. Kane weighed the two futures in a heartbeat. Run and be hunted like a dog, or walk and be judged by a jury with its meal already in its mouth. He closed his hand over the cell key, felt its teeth, and let it sit. "Front's fine," he said, the lie tasting of tin. Delaney's eyes narrowed a hair, as if he'd caught the scent of something beneath the usual dust. He turned to Holt. "Fetch him out." Holt fumbled the door open. The lock sounded too loud. Kane stepped through the space with the ease of a man who'd walked worse thresholds. When Delaney reached to lay a show hand on his arm, Kane angled away neatly and picked up his Colt from the desk. He held it butt first to Holt. "Unload," he said. The deputy worked the cylinder, hands shaking a little, the empty mouths of the chambers clicking like teeth. They went out into the hard daylight together. Marshal, deputy, sheriff, 3 points on a triangle drawn in dust. The town had grown around the jail, thick with breath and heat. Women with aprons still on. Miners with lamp wax on their hands. Boys up on the railings like sparrows. The church bell rope twitched, uncertain if it had been summoned yet. Delaney raised a palm, and the noise fell from a shout to a murmur. He did not bellow. He let his voice travel, thin and clear. "Cedar Bluff," he called. "The law has your fear and your fury. Keep both, but put them in my keeping for the afternoon. Sundown, we'll hold a coroner's inquest in the old courthouse, and we'll decide by witness and oath whether this man," a small tilt of the hat toward Kane, "shot his friend in malice or in law. Till then, you give me quiet." Quiet? Ike Posey, a gallows gossip with a gut, spat loud enough for the spittle to flash. "Man killed Eli, and you want us to sit like hens." The blacksmith stepped forward. His big hands looked lost without a tool in them. "The boy was in the way," he said, voice rough with a truth he couldn't lift high enough. "I seen it." A woman hissed. He could have shot the derringer out his hand. "Ain't no man that fast," another shot back. "Sheriff is," came a half-dozen replies, half awe and half accusation. Heat swelled. The crowd leaned, a body with many heads bending toward the promise of blood. Somewhere, rope kissed wood. Kane heard the slight rasp and knew something heavy was testing a beam. "Listen," Delaney said, and his voice cut through the argument like a whetted blade. "You'll have your sight and your say at sundown. Until then, my men will keep the peace. The first fool who throws a rope before a verdict will learn how hemp tastes himself." The smile when he said it was small and terrible and perfect for control. Murmurs slid back a notch. The rope left the beam like a snake undecided about striking. Kane felt the stares, a heat on skin hotter than the sun. The badge at his chest was cool, the metal a coin of winter under cloth. He could have spoken. He could have told them about the derringer, about Eli's vest lining, about a brand burned into the fence the night his world went to ash. He could have said, "Ledger," and watched the town's eyes turn from him to the men who salted their tables. He shut his mouth. He would not hang Eli in the street before the dirt on the man's shirt had dried. They walked him back inside to wait. Holt locked him up again, shoulders hunched like a boy in a storm. Delaney remained by the door, watching the town through the warped glass. Big cat, lazy. "Why an inquest?" Holt asked, as if he were asking about weather. "We could." "Because they already decided," Delaney murmured, eyes on the window. "And I intend to decide what they decided." Holt blinked, nonplussed. Delaney turned his head, studied him. "You keep your nose clean, deputy," he said sweetly. Ink has a way of getting on men who can't read it. When the marshal left, the air lost a layer of pressure but gained a film of sweat. Holt hovered by the desk, twisting the telegraph slip into a crippled bird. "You got anything to say before sundown, Sheriff?" he asked, without looking up. "Anything I ought to know, in case it goes hard?" Kane considered the man. He could smell the fear on Holt, the acrid, boyish kind, not the cold calculation he'd smelled on Delaney. He could hand the deputy a piece of truth and watch it burn him, or he could keep it and let the man stumble in the dark. "Yeah," Kane said. "Eli wasn't born a snake. He learned to slither from someone who fed him." Holt swallowed. It landed like a stone. Afternoon slid by like a dragged chain. The town's noise changed timbre. Less outrage, more appetite. Through the bars, Kane watched the gallows shadow creep across the square and shorten again. He listened to flies buzz on the windowsill where someone had spilled sweet coffee. He smelled the musk of hemp in the corner where the rope coil lived, old, useful, waiting. Lila came on quiet feet when the office had emptied for a minute. A figure out of the darker seam of daylight, veil raised, her jaw set. She held a laundry basket as cover, and the starch from it made the air taste like chalk. "He means to stage it," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "A good show at the old courthouse, then put you on a chain and ship you south." "You sound sure," Kane said. "I watch numbers," she answered. "Men like Delaney only do public mercy when private money's already banked." Kane let the cot take his weight again. "The book?" "I went to look." Her eyes cut to the side, the first time he'd seen them uncertain. "The plank you told the boy, third from the north door. Someone pried it before dawn. Nails are bright. Either your little messenger had eyes on him, or he told the wrong person." The cell got smaller without moving. Kane could almost hear the pry bar's slow complaint. A town is a sieve. Secrets run downhill. "Name me a suspect," he said. Lila didn't blink. "Sable and Lathrop's freight boss, Samuel Lawton. He signs with an S and a long bar on the LSL. He pays night candles. That's code for muscle. And he owes Marshal Delaney for keeping wagons moving when they ought to have stopped." She hesitated. "And there's your deputy, who pocketed a scrap with that split lightning brand like it burned him to hold it." Outside, a hammer rang twice. Someone was testing the courthouse door. Kane stood. The cot creaked in relief. He curled his fingers around the bars, knuckles whitening until old scars showed pale. "At sundown, they'll drag me under the dead judge's stare and ask for a clean story," he said. "If that ledger's gone, the only story left is what I can make them taste." Lila set the laundry basket down and lifted a small, well-used knife from beneath the folded shirts. She slid it under the bars. "Knots sometimes come out cleaner with steel," she said. "Don't use it to carve your name in the table. Use it to cut rope." Bootsteps stacked up outside. Voices crowded the porch. The preacher's careful tremor, Ike Posey's eager bleat, the blacksmith's low thunder, Holt's thin attempt to command. The sun tipped toward the courthouse roofline. Dust in the window made the light look like whiskey held to an eye. Delaney's voice glided through the noise, pleasant as a parlor song. "Bring him," he said. "Let's show Cedar Bluff how justice looks when it wears a star." Holt slid the key into the lock. For an instant the jail held its breath, every nail and hinge listening. From somewhere down the street, a boy's voice lifted, panicked, cutting across the hum. "Mr. Kane!" The plank. Someone. A palm clapped over the voice. A scuffle. Then silence so sudden the fly's buzz went sharp as a file. Holt turned, heart in his face, eyes asking things his mouth couldn't risk. Kane looked past him to the window where the courthouse's broken pediment cut a black tooth against the falling sun. He could see, as plain as if he stood inside it, a gloved hand in dusted light, prying up a third board, lifting out a little leather book, and a smile that belonged to a man who'd never paid for anything with his own blood. The lock clicked. The door began to swing, and a noose, lowered from the gallows beam outside, drifted in the draft like a question that already knew its answer. They marched him in the open, because that was how men like Delaney kept a grip on a town. Hold the wolf by the ears where everyone could see you weren't afraid. The sun slid toward evening, turning the boardwalk nails into little needles of fire. Dust drifted like breath in front of the old courthouse, its paint long since blown thin by wind, its windows clouded with the fine white of sun-rotted glass. A gallows beam jutted from the annex roof like the stump of a broken finger. The noose hung ready, swaying to the lazy breeze with the sound of rope on wood, a whisper that belonged to dark rooms and last prayers. Inside, the main hall held the day's heat like a stove. Pews from an abandoned church had been dragged in and lined up. The judge's dais still wore its dignity, despite the mouse-nibbled skirting. Light fell through a skylight cracked in a spider's web, laying a bright scar across the floorboards. Cedar Bluff crowded the benches with the appetite of a county fair and the silence of a funeral. The blacksmith took a row near the front, jaw clenched. His boy, wheat hair combed flat, sat small and upright, a bruise rising like a storm cloud on his cheek. Delaney made a picture for the town, hat set careful on the table, star on his vest polished enough to bend the sun. Deputy Holt stood one pace off his shoulder, too stiff, too pale. On the far wall, a freight boss in a city waistcoat watched from under a brim he never lifted. Samuel Lawton, Sable, and Lathrop. Kane recognized the church-quiet pride of a man who had never shoveled out a stall with his own hands. By order of the territory, Delaney announced in a voice smooth as oiled walnut, we'll hold a coroner's inquest with the witnesses present, and God Almighty as our witness besides. He turned an inch. Deputy Holt, swear them. Holt's voice wavered through the formula. The first witness was the blacksmith. He stood, hat in hand, and swore, eyes on Kane only once, brief, like a man touching a hot stove. The boy had a derringer, the blacksmith said, words ground out low. Eli snatched it too fast for sense. Sheriff drew before that hammer fell. That's the long and short. A noise rolled through the room. Approval, disapproval, the human taste for blood meeting the older taste for truth. Delaney's smile didn't change. And yet, he said gently, a friend lies cold. He let the hunger have a crumb and then took it away. Next witness. Ike Posey rattled to his feet, mouth already slick with talk. He always said the law and justice were two different horses. Ike told the ceiling, now we know which one he rides. Kane listened to it all with the patience of iron. He could feel the little knife Lila had given him laid flat along his belt, its weight no more than a mouthful of water, but sharp enough to change how a rope sits on a man's neck. He could feel the folded scrap with the split lightning brand against his palm. Eli's last gift, torn free with dying fingers. And behind his ribs, like a coin heating over a coal, sat the thought of a ledger, Eli's little book, stolen from under the third plank of the dais before the sun was up. Sheriff Kane, Delaney said at last. Kane rose, The room leaned. Even the flies seemed to pause mid-air. "You shot Eli Mercer," Delaney said softly, giving the crowd what they wanted in 5 plain words. "Stand and say why." Kane set his hands on the rail, the wood worn smooth by 100 other hands who had begged or lied across it. He kept his voice low, iron filings pulled into a line by a magnet. He reached for a hammer with a child in the line. He said, "I did what the law would have done if it had my sight and my hands." He let the next sentence live, and because he carried a secret that would have killed more than me if I'd let him walk. A stir. Taking the room's breath, then, Kane drew Eli's torn scrap from his coat and held it where the lamplight could find it. "You know this?" The brand's lines, cattle heads split by a lightning stroke, glinted ugly on the paper. Half the room nodded on reflex. Ranchers do. Teamsters do. Lawton's face stayed smooth, but his shoulders forgot how to sit at ease for the space of one heartbeat. "It was cut into a fence post outside my house the night it burned," Kane said. The words were dry as alkali. "I found it again today. Here." He lifted the scrap a fraction. Eli Mercer tore this from a page he didn't want dying on the ground. Delaney's smile showed 2 white crescents. "Story and paper," he murmured. "We'll need more than both to hang a man's guilt on a peg." "Then ask your freight friend for the plank he pried before dawn," Kane said, turning his head to look at the dais. Nails along the 3rd board winked bright, where some impatient hand had levered them up and driven them down again. He let people see it. Let them whisper. Lila Gray rose from a back pew with her laundry basket like any other woman would. She stepped down the aisle calm as counting and set a folded paper on the clerk's table. "Freight chit," she said, clean as a ledger line. "Sable and Lathrop, Cedar Bluff office. Payment to EM for night candles and quiet freight. Signed SL. Counter signed by an agent with the initial D. Paid in full." Delaney didn't turn to look at her. He didn't need to. "Bring it," he said, and Holt, grateful for something to do, scooped the paper up and handed it to his master. A small exhale went through the room. Lawton's hand slid to his pocket, then thought better of the trip and stayed. Delaney read with his eyes only. Then for the room, he smiled almost kindly. "Night candles," he said, conversational, as if they were talking about winter tallow. "Teamster slang for lantern oil." Lila looked at him and did not blink. "Not on my books," she answered. "On mine, night candles buys men you don't want to name." "By thunder," Ike Posey whispered, delighted. "She means guns." Delaney set the chit down with a nightness that made it clear he'd like to set it on fire. "Clerk," he said, "mark the exhibit." He pivoted to Kane. "Where is this miracle book that supplies such scraps? The one you say your friend bled on?" The pleasant tone peeled back one layer. "Where is your proof, Sheriff?" Kane's eyes tracked to the dais, to the north door where a boy had slipped in, dawn quick, to the bright nails. He felt the weight of the little knife again, and the unsteady moral slope at his feet. He could save Eli's name, bury the man under the soft dirt of friendship, and sweat out Delaney's rope. Or he could cut into the floor of the law itself and drag up whatever rot lay hidden there. He stepped away from the rail. Holt moved to block him. "You'll stay put," he said, voice cracking. Kane looked at him, just looked, and Holt's resolve puddled at his boots. Kane mounted the dais in 3 steady steps. Every board knew his weight. He had tracked outlaws across floors just like this, listening for hollows. He laid his palm flat where the nail-heads shone new, and the board whispered back the dirty truth. Bright nail, bright lie. The little knife slid warm and obedient into his hand. "Folks," he said without raising his voice, "law ain't a table you cut unless you mean to eat what's underneath." Then he set the blade where the pry marks already lived and levered. Delaney's tone didn't change. "Deputy," he said, "stop him." Holt didn't move. The board came up crying, tarry nails clinging like old sins. Under it, dust lay thick and square, the print of a book no longer there. But farther back, where a lazy thief's fingers wouldn't stretch, another shape, hunkered in shadow, a tin box the color of stove smoke, wrapped once with rawhide and sealed with a freight office wafer stamped SL. Kane slid it out to the light. The room leaned like wheat in wind. Lawton's hand finally went all the way to his pocket and stayed there, crushing a handkerchief. "Mr. Lawton," Delaney said softly, "would you like to tell Cedar Bluff what we're about to see?" The freight boss smoothed his waistcoat, and for the first time his voice had no room in it. "Old logs," he said. "Storage. Nothing more." Kane cut the rawhide. The seal gave with the sound of skin tearing. Inside lay a tidy ledger, smaller than a Bible, larger than a man's conscience. The top page smelled of dust, ink, and something else that curled his gut, a breath of singe, a ghost of pitch. He turned pages until Eli's hand walked out of the ink at him, clumsy, honest letters cornered by new-taught cautions, columns marked with dates, names dressed in code, amounts in the language of darkness. He read with the careful voice a man uses for scripture. July 14th, night candles for the South Pass, SL 5. Diatu, September 3rd, quiet freight along the Creek Road, SL 4, D3, October 9th. He felt his mouth go dry. Night of ash. The room went still enough to hear the gallows rope rub its beam outside. Eli's blunt hand had tried to hide the line with extra ink, but truth bled through. D to SL, make an example at the sheriff's place, break his back or his faith. Paid double. The blacksmith swore, a small prayer punched sideways. A woman sobbed once, Mrs. Mercer's voice raw and lost, somewhere in the back, and then choked it down. Delaney didn't flinch. That was his gift, and his doom. Initials, he said. Easy. Could be any D in the county. Kane's thumb went to the next page. A slip of paper had been pasted there with starch that had gone brittle. He lifted a corner with the tip of Lila's knife. The slip came away clean and showed a ledger man's vanity, full name set down once as if to teach future readers how to read his cowardice. Paid upon my order, Emmett Delaney, account satisfied. Sable and Lathrop, Cedar Bluff. The room exhaled like a kicked mule. Delaney's men touched their guns, and then remembered the room had eyes. Delaney smiled the way men smile at rattlers from the wrong end. "A forgery," he murmured, already choosing the next hill to stand on. "I'll see a booksman from Santa Lucia testify. Meantime, we'll not have a mob try paper like a man." Kane felt the ledger tremble in his hands, not from fear but from rage banked too long. He looked down at the ink, the neat murders. He looked up at the man with the star who had bought fire like other men buy tea. "You paid to burn my wife," he said, and his voice was a quiet that made candle flames think about going out. "You paid to kill my boy." Delaney's face didn't change. His eyes moved once, to the noose shadow sliding along the wall as the sun tilted, and then back to Kane. "Careful, Sheriff," he said pleasantly. calumny is another rope altogether. Something moved in the corner of Kane's vision, the blacksmith's boy lifting a hand, as if the question he'd been taught not to ask had turned into a signal. A side door creaked. Lila's head snapped that way, all the patience gone from her face. The freight boss had decided waiting was a fool's trade. Samuel Lawton slid a derringer out of his waistcoat like a man palming an extra ace and leveled it at the ledger. "Paper burns," he said in a voice that shook. "Let's see if your proof burns pretty." The derringer cracked. Small, mean, bright as a silverfish in a pan. The shot shattered a lamp, sprayed glass, put fire into oil. In an instant, the dais was a tongue of orange, licking up toward the skylight. People screamed and surged. Holt shouted and drew too late. Delaney didn't flinch. He smiled. Kane had one breath to choose between saving ink and saving a room full of sinners and saints. He folded the ledger into his coat in a single practiced motion, swept the tin lid wide with his forearm, and heeled it into the flames, smothering a newborn fire like a man choking a snake before it strikes twice. Smoke crawled under the skylight. The noose's shadow on the far wall quivered like a living thing, and from the courthouse doors men pushed in hard, 3 with brass badges that weren't this county's shape, and rifles that weren't this town's make. One raised his voice over the scream and the crackle. "By order of the territory, the prisoner is remanded to martial custody now." Delaney's smile finally reached his eyes. Kane straightened on the burning dais, the ledger heavy and hot against his ribs, the knife warm in his palm, the town watching with fear and hunger. He let the little badge on his chest spin once between finger and thumb, catching the firelight like a coin tossed to choose a fate. "Come take me," he said. The first rifle lifted. The skylight's cracked diamond gleamed, and just as fingers found triggers, the blacksmith's boy stood on the front pew and shouted, voice breaking with fear and triumph both, "Mr. Kane, there's a second book." Dawn rolled in thin and gray, laying a sheet of chill over Gallows Street. The wind lifted grit from the hard pan and set the gallows rope to a slow, whispering sway. Sheriff Kane stood beneath that rope with his coat collar up and hat brim low, eyes like stormed steel as the first riders ghosted out of the light. Federal dust, blue sashes, tin stars that didn't belong to his county. They came with the sound of iron and paper, irons slapping against saddles, paper snapping from a marshal's satchel. The leader, Abner Pike, broad in the chest and mean in the jaw, swung down and flicked open a leather wallet. The red seal on the order looked like dried blood. "By authority of the territorial governor," Pike said, voice carrying on the flat morning, "this town is under federal supervision pending inquiry into the shooting of Eli." He let the dead friend's name hang, a bell tolling once. Effective immediately, Sheriff Kane is relieved of duty. The wind kicked dust against Kane's boots. He didn't blink. His silver badge spun slowly in his fingers as if deciding which way to fall. Judge Beaufort Harlan waddled up the boardwalk, whiskers trembling, eyes already calculating his place in the new pecking order. He set a portable inkwell on the jailhouse step, like a preacher laying a Bible at a sinner's feet. "Let's not make a circus, Mr. Kane," Harlan wheezed. "Hand over your keys and your ledger. We'll see this unfortunate matter handled by the book." Kane glanced toward the jail window. Inside, behind shadowed bars, a slight figure watched. Lark, the Apache girl with river-black hair, eyes sharpened by fear. She had whispered the secret in Part 4's dark, that Eli had worn 2 faces, that the black notebook Kane found in the blood was more than ink. Names, shipments, a map of quiet betrayals. She had also said one other thing, voice barely there over the ticking clock. Someone high up wanted that notebook buried with the man who carried it. Marshal Pike stepped closer, boots ringing on the planks. Let's start with evidence. The book your deputy turned up. He smiled without warmth. We'll keep it safe. Kane could smell tobacco on the man, a sharp, peppery blend, and underneath that, oiled metal. He could hear the rope creak overhead. He could feel his temper drag its nails along the inside of his ribs. By the book, Kane said, voice flat. So you'll log it, then let the jury see it. Of course. Pike's eyes slid quick to Judge Harlan. Harlan looked at the gallows as if he'd set it himself. A handful of townsfolk had drifted onto the street, keeping careful distance. Miller, blacksmith, Mrs. Tally, the midwife, cradling a shawl like a shield. Kane sensed their breathing, quick and shallow, the way cattle breathe when lightning prowls the hills. He felt the whole town recoiling from something it had invited in by being afraid too long. Keys, Harlan repeated, for appearance's sake. Kane took his time. He slid the badge into his pocket, like a man who meant to give it up on his own terms, then pulled the iron ring from his belt. The jail keys chimed against Marshal Pike's waiting palm. The sound was small and bitter. Pike nodded to two men. They peeled off and posted at the jail door. Chains clinked. Lark's shadow moved behind the bars. The second the marshal's men entered the office, Kane stepped sideways so he could watch both them and Pike, reading their shoulders, their breath. The deputy inside, a stranger in a federal sash, opened the desk drawer and brought out the black notebook, like he was handling a bird that might cut his fingers. Pike didn't bother with a ledger. He slid the book into his own coat, quick and smooth. That book is evidence, Kane said. The words came out quiet as winter. You log it, Marshal. Sign it out. Pike didn't flinch. You forfeited your say when you shot your best friend, Sheriff. The gallows rope whispered. The street held its breath. Kane's right hand hovered half an inch from his holster. Habit, not intent. He wasn't about to draw on a federal man in daylight with the town watching, but he felt the hinge of something in him, law creaking on the nail of justice about to give. From the cell, Lark called, voice thin. He'll kill me if you let him, Sheriff. They killed Eli to stop the names. Quiet, barked a federal deputy, banging his baton on the bars. The sound rattled down Kane's spine. Lark flinched back into shadow. Judge Harlan cleared his throat. She is a material witness. She will be moved to the circuit jail for her own protection. He smiled, as if he believed it. Protection, Kane said, looking directly at Pike, like Eli got. Abner Pike's smile sharpened. Your friend was a tragic mistake. The bullet was yours. It was a clean shot, burned into Kane's marrow. Flash, recoil, Eli's mouth opening like a question he'd never finish. But the angle, the powder, the way the bullet had entered Eli's coat, had told another story, one nobody in this street wanted to say aloud. Somebody else had fired, too, from the dry goods roof, with a smaller caliber, a hair later. A second bite of fate. Transfer the girl at noon, Pike said to his men. We ride before the sun turns mean. They set to work with a bureaucrat's speed, stamping papers, nailing the marshal's circular to the post, straightening the rope on the gallows as if that were only practical housekeeping. Kane watched the rope coil and uncoil, saw the sun catch the knots. He tasted old smoke on a wind that wasn't there. Memory of another morning when a boy had cried for his mother at the end of a drop, and Kane had been 2 days too late. His jaw ached from how hard he held it shut. Mrs. Tally moved near his shoulder, voice low. "You gonna let him take her, Sheriff?" He turned the badge in his pocket until it warmed under his thumb. "Law says I could stand down." Law didn't wake in the night screaming for her dead son. She whispered. Justice might have. The noon bell was a dull iron tongue, choked by dust. The sun lifted heat off the street in shimmering sheets. Pike's men marched Lark out with shackles on her wrists, chains rattling, the sound of small rivers. She was barefoot, steps careful over splinters, chin up with a pride that cut Kane open. A cinematic stillness fell, the kind where flies hang in the air and everyone forgets to swallow. The girl's shadow crossed the gallows posts. Pike paused under the crossbeam and glanced up at the noose like a man admiring architecture. "Marshal," Harlan said, wiping his brow. "There's no call to." "Symbol," Pike answered, not bothering to lower his voice. "Let the town remember who holds the rope." Kane stepped off the boardwalk. Gravel hissed under his boots. He found himself standing between Lark and the space where the heat shimmered around Pike's men. His hand did not go to his gun. It went to his badge. He brought it out into the hard noon and felt the stamp of it against his palm. "Law ain't always justice," he said, voice low as a prayer, clear as a bell, "but justice rides with me." He opened his fingers and let the badge fall. It struck, rang, spun in the dust, and came to rest, face up. The sound it made was small and enormous, the exact sound of a man choosing. Pike's eyes narrowed. "Step aside." "No." Kane's coat shifted as he set his feet. "You take her to the circuit jail by the book, in daylight, with a proper chain of custody. You log that notebook, and you swear every man here saw you do it. Or you'll drag me and half this town before you drag her anywhere." A tremor ran through the gathered folk, fear turning to something that felt like breath after holding it too long. The blacksmith squared his shoulders. Mrs. Tally lifted her chin. Two boys on the mercantile steps stood taller, as if learning how to wear their bodies for the first time. Pike stared at the circle forming around a lawman without a badge. Then he smiled a different smile, one that didn't bother to hide its edges. He raised a hand. His men drew back hammers with clicks like beetles, sharp, multiplying. "Arrest him," Pike said softly. "Obstruction of federal justice." They came fast. The irons were cold as creek stones when they bit Kane's wrists. He didn't fight them. He watched the notebook ride Pike's ribs with every breath. He watched the rope's long shadow slide toward his boots as the sun leaned west. "Judge," Pike said, "I'll be borrowing your gallows at dawn. Men need reminding." "For who?" Kane asked. "Her or me?" Pike's smile was lazy and slow. "Whichever the law requires." They hauled Kane up the courthouse steps, an abandoned courthouse whose cracked windows still remembered verdicts. Inside, the air was stale with paper, mildew, and old decisions. They sat him on a chair carved with someone else's initials and kicked the door shut. The bolt drove home with a dull, resigned thud. Through the slatted blinds, Kane could see the gallows framed perfect, as a photograph in a dime novel. He could see Lark on the bench outside the jail with 2 rifles on her, and townsfolk on the boards that squeaked like anxious mice. He could feel the courthouse breathe around him, old wood expanding in the heat, old ghosts leaning in for the verdict. A shape shifted in the deeper shade behind the judge's bench. A thin hand slid from the darkness and set something on the table, Eli's pocket watch, the brass face cracked, chain broken, the back pried open to show a sliver of paper tucked beneath the mechanism. The hand withdrew. Kane's pulse thudded once, hard as a hammer blow. A voice came with the scent of lamp oil and dust, barely more than breath. He hid it where you'd look last. Names, routes, the man who paid Pike. But we'll only get one chance to move it. Kane lifted his eyes toward the shadow and saw who it belonged to. It was the last face he expected to see alive in that room. And outside, beyond the blinds, the gallows rope gave another long, patient creak. Moonlight slanted through the torn roof like cold knives, striping the abandoned courthouse in pale bars that cut across broken pews and a judge's bench, split by time. Wind ran its fingers through the shattered windows and made the rope of a long-forgotten gallows groan. Sheriff Kane stood in the doorway, hat brim low, the dust of the ride still clinging to his coat. He rolled the silver star across his knuckles until it spun and stilled, that small weight steadying the storm inside him. Boots scuffed on stone behind the bench. 6 men stepped from the shadows with rifles, coats damp from evening dew. The man in the middle wore a fresh-pressed frock coat and the smugness of a federal mandate. Territorial Marshal Lyle Deacon, mustache clipped to a cruel line, a pinched scar where the corner of his mouth never smiled. His badge flashed once in the moonlight, like the blink of a viper. "You came alone," Deacon said. His voice was molasses poured over gravel, a rare act of obedience. Folks say you don't do that often. Kane's hand rested on the pearl of his colt. "I obey the law when the law ain't crooked." Deacon tilted his head, considering. "You shot your deputy, Jonah Pike, your friend. That's crooked enough." The name hit like a hammer wrapped in felt. The courthouse carried it back in a low echo. Jonah. Dust skittered along the floor like mice. Kane took one step inside. The boards complained under his heel. "You sent him to his grave," Deacon went on, "because he knew where the ledger was, Judge Tolliver's accounts, the railroad kickbacks, bribes for gallows built faster than schools. You've stirred a nest. Tonight you put the stick down." Kane's gaze slid past the marshal and found the proof Deacon had brought to keep negotiations honest. 2 shadows bound to a bench against the wall. Lark, the Apache girl with a braid like a black river and eyes that had watched too much. And Widow Avery, jaw lifted, hands clenched so tight the knuckles showed white through grime. Rope bit both their wrists. Iron cuffs weighted their ankles. Kane's badge stopped spinning. Deacon nodded toward them, as if he'd noticed the silver pause. "Insurance." He smiled without teeth. "You hand me Tolliver's ledger. They walk out breathing. You keep playing hero. They're the first to hang in this museum of justice." Wind pulled at the rotten curtains. Far off, a coyote yipped and was quieted by distance and fear. Kane stepped farther into the long room. His boots made a different sound on stone, hollow under the gallows beam. "You said ledger," Kane said. His voice was flat, the drawl clean as cut leather. "I said I'd bring truth. You always did like poetry." Deacon spread his hands. "Truth, ledger. Call it what you like. I want it." He lifted 2 fingers. A rifleman in the choir loft cocked his Winchester. Steel clicked. Glass shivered with the soft pressure of a barrel nesting in broken panes. Kane lifted his hand away from the Colt. "If I give it, you let them go. Immediately." The marshal's tongue touched the scar at his mouth's edge. "A lawman's word. Law ain't always justice," Kane said, the old vow rising up from where grief kept it. "But justice rides with me." Deacon's smile hardened. and justice tonight arrives in a leather satchel. Kane unslung the satchel. The strap creaked. He set it on the judge's cracked bench. Moonlight feathered the edges. He didn't open it. "You do it," he told Deacon. "You want a thing, you mark it with your own hands." Deacon's fingers drummed, slow, parlor manners on a gallows night. He glanced once at Lark and the widow, and then forward again, small calculation moving behind his eyes. He came around the bench, careful only in appearance. No weight on the boards that moaned too loud, no silhouette in a window where a second rifle might tag him by accident. A cautious man, Kane thought. A man who'd learned to survive by letting others burn. Deacon reached the satchel, worked the buckle. His breath hitched so softly only a hunter would have heard it. Ledger paper peeled up like a scab. Neat columns. Tolliver's seal in wax, broken and dirt gritted from being dragged through a crawl space under the old jail before Kane ever laid hands on it. Money in names. Names in blood. "You see it," Kane said. "I do," Deacon breathed. "Then hear this." Kane's voice lowered until the wind had to hush to listen. "Jonah Pike didn't die for a ledger. He died because he told me your noose was coming for that girl first." His chin tilted toward Lark. "Said you were buying gallows rope by the mile and feeding it children to keep your books balanced." Deacon's jaw worked once. He lied. He begged. Kane's eyes were iron. "And I believed him enough to shoot him before he made the choice you trained him to make." The marshal's mask rippled. There it was, the small, ugly pulse of truth. He snapped the ledger closed and signaled. A rifleman kicked the bench holding Lark and the widow forward. A second, lowered his gun to slice at the ropes. "Careful," Deacon warned without turning his head. "If the sheriff thinks this is his redemption night, I'd rather he keeps the fantasy a minute longer." Lark lifted her chin at Kane. A faint nod. She'd heard the line he recited when the world tilted. Law, not justice. She was counting the beats between his words and his draw, the way a hunter counts heartbeats before the arrow. Widow Avery's lips moved around a prayer that sounded more like a curse. Deacon lifted the ledger again, and that was when Kane saw it. A dark watermark circling the territorial seal, faint, like a thumbprint ghosted there forever. Not Tolliver's ring. Jonah's. The day the two men had stood in this very room swearing an oath. Jonah had pressed his thumb into the seal, grinning like a fool at being official. He'd pressed it in the habit of a boy who sealed letters to his ma with plum jam. The same print, the same swirl, now fixed in wax on a page that recorded gallows orders and payments for bodies measured by the yard. Kane's guts turned to glass. "You made him your clerk," he said softly. "Made him write his own part in your ledger. When I put him down, he was trying to tell me he'd signed the death warrants." "Don't be sentimental," Deacon murmured. "He signed receipts." Rope hissed. Iron cuffs dropped. Lark and the widow were freed. Half-freed, really. Ankles still chained together with a length of rusted tether someone had found in the clerk's room. Deacon raised a hand, and guns lowered an inch, just enough for breath to move. "You see?" Deacon said, turning with ledger in hand. "We can all be civilized men. Now, as civilized men, I'll need your sidearm." Kane's palm brushed the Colt, but didn't take it. Wind breathed through the holes in the ceiling. The gallows beam creaked like an old thought. "Holster stays," Kane said. A shadow shifted in the choir loft. Someone hissed, "Marshal!" But the warning came too late for what had already been set in motion. Because as Deacon spoke, as Kane spoke, as the ledger breathed its damp paper smell, Lark's fingers were working the chain along the floor, sliding it over to the iron stove door where rust had eaten the hinge near through. Widow Avery, quick as a dryland fox, hooked the chain's loop over the hinge and wrenched. The pin popped. In the same heartbeat, the chain leapt free like a snake uncoiled. "Now," Kane said. His hand blurred. The colt came up and barked once, the sound cracking the courthouse bones. The shot shattered the lantern on the judge's bench. Dark spilled like oil, fire blossomed with it. Deacon flinched and dropped the ledger as flame licked down the edge of corrupted paper. Lark slung the freed chain in a silver arc. It wrapped the ankles of the nearest rifleman. He fell like a felled calf, his shot burning a hole in the ceiling and letting the moon in harder. Chaos poured in. Smoke rolled. Kane moved through it like a man who'd memorized the room. 2 steps, low, another shot to the balcony rail. The rifleman there pitched backward, body drumming down rotten pews. Lark slid across the floorboards, a whisper in smoke, cutting Widow Avery's wrist rope with a nail she'd palmed. Deacon recovered fast. He kicked the burning ledger under the bench, fire trailing it like a comet tail, and drew a derringer from his sleeve. The little gun kissed the air where Kane's heart had been a breath earlier. The bullet took wood. Splinters puffed like sawdust breath. "Hold," Deacon snapped, stepping behind the bench, smoke haloing him now. His voice cut the frenzy like a blade. "I will burn this place to the foundations and call it an accident. Or, Sheriff, you can holster, step forward, and we end this with handcuffs and paperwork." Kane's eyes were ash and winter steel. He could feel the room choosing, the rope above, the fire racing along the judge's bench toward the stack of old docket boxes where dust lay thick as flour, the stinging breath of Lark at his left, the widow's ribs heaving like bellows. "Drop the colt," Deacon said. "Do one righteous thing in a night full of sins." Kane's thumb eased the hammer down until it clicked home. He set the colt on a broken pew with a care that made every man there relax a hair they hadn't realized they held. He lifted both hands. Smoke smeared the knuckles gray. "Justice, Marshal," he said, voice gone quiet in the way a river goes quiet before it climbs its banks. It rides a hard horse. Deacon stepped out, cuffs ready, iron jaws gleaming dull. He was close enough now that Kane could smell pomade and spent powder, the reek of a man who masked a rot with rose water. Deacon reached for Kane's wrists, which was when the floor spoke. A deep, tired groan rolled up from the foundations. Fire had found the docket boxes. Flame ran the old paper like a match down a fuse line. The gallows beam's iron bracket, bolted to posts, honeycombed by termites, shrieked as a hot nail let go. The long beam sagged, swayed, and dropped an inch. Dust geysered. Everyone looked up. "Move," Kane barked, shoving Deacon backward, not as mercy, but as tactic, because the beam was dropping toward the bench, and the ledger Deacon had just kicked beneath it. Because if that evidence burned, law and justice, both would go blind. A hand grabbed Kane's sleeve and yanked. Lark's. Another hand shoved the widow toward the door. The beam sagged again. Smoke bruised the air purple. Flame flared along the ledger's edge and reached for the old wax seal with Jonah's thumbprint like a tongue. And through the thunder of wood failing and men swearing and iron screaming loose, a new voice cut like a bell. "Hold this house." Judge Horace Tolliver's voice, alive, near, boomed from the back hall. He stepped from the records room with 3 fresh men and a shotgun, his signet ring winking in the firelight, his robe thrown over trousers like he'd risen from a grave and dressed wrong. "Arrest them all!" Kane turned, coat snapping in the heat gust. The judge's ring, Tolliver's seal, the same curl as the wax, glinted with soot and greed. For half a heartbeat, everything held. The burning ledger, the sagging gallows, the barrel of Tolliver's shotgun finding Kane's chest. Deacon's face twitching toward fury at being upstaged. Then the gallows beam let go, with a sound like a church roof collapsing in a storm, and all of it came down. The gallows beam let go like a thunderhead splitting. Timber screamed, dust leapt. The judge's bench vanished in a crack of wood and splinters. Kane threw his shoulder into Lark and Widow Avery, driving them flat as the beam scythed the space where their heads had been. Deacon dove, ledger clutched to his ribs. Judge Tolliver staggered backward, shotgun pinwheeling as the collapsing beam tore the air between him and his prey. Smoke rolled low. Moonlight broke into shards. The courthouse breathed old heat and new fire. Kane came up from his knees with ash in his teeth and the taste of burnt ink in his mouth. The ledger had skittered, pages fanning, one corner licking flame. He booted a broken plank over it, smothering fire, not truth. A rifle cracked from the choir loft. Splinters stitched his coat. Kane rolled behind a pew, felt powder sting his cheek. He answered with one clean shot. In the broken window, a shadow jerked and fell, boots drumming down through rotten rail. "Hold fire!" Deacon barked, rising in smoke, derringer in one hand, and a look in his eyes that said he wanted to shoot more than he wanted to speak. "We're not burning the evidence, or ourselves." "Then step away from it," Kane said, voice steady as a plumb line. He stood into the ash-blue moonlight, hat brim low, colt canted, but not yet singing. "Hands where God can count 'em." Tolliver tried to make a speech of his own, but smoke bit his throat and turned it into a cough. Widow Avery's hand flashed. She flung a fallen hymn book. It hit the shotgun's barrels and shoved his aim wide. The blast chewed a pillar instead of Kane's heart. The courthouse coughed fire again. "Enough!" Deacon's voice found iron. "Put him down!" No one moved fast enough. A door in the side wall banged. A ferret-eyed figure slammed into the smoke with a pistol in both hands, and fear painted plain on his face. Holt. His hat was gone. His hair lay in sweaty ridges. "Drop 'em!" he yelled, high and hard, the kind of courage a man finds when he's run out of hiding. His gaze snapped to Tolliver. "Judge, hands high. I swear I'll—" Tolliver sneered. You don't swear. You simper." Something inside Holt broke. He fired. Tolliver howled as the load carved a red mouth across his robe sleeve and part of his pride. The shotgun clattered. Holt blinked at what he'd done, then kept his gun up with both hands shaking and both eyes mean. "By thunder," he panted, "I ain't simpering now." Lila Gray's voice carried from the vestibule like a steel thread. "Lanterns!" She hauled 2 townsmen in after her, the blacksmith big as a gate, and the preacher in his shirt sleeves. Faces smoked and set. Behind them spilled more. Mrs. Tally with a bucket, the miller with a hook, boys with their eyes too wide and their mouths set too hard. The town had come. Kane didn't smile. He lifted the colt a hair and drew a line with his words. Marshal Deacon, Judge Tolliver, Samuel Lawton. He threw the freight boss's name into the smoke and watched him flinch by the door. On your knees, hands laced. Do it now. Guns all around twitched toward him, then toward the ledger, then toward the faces behind him that looked like jurors. Deacon calculated faster than smoke moves. He raised his hands, eyes on Kane, all venom tucked under manners. He knelt. Tolliver sank too, hissing, rope burn red across his arm, ring wetted by his own blood. Lawton sagged into a crouch and tried to vanish inside his waistcoat. "Deputy," Deacon said, silk back on his tongue. "Arrest this man. He's a murderer. He—" Holt's pistol barrel thunked against Deacon's badge. "Shut your mouth," Holt said, and the whole room heard the years he'd swallowed. "You're under arrest for murder, racketeering, and—" He groped, "for making me sick of my own reflection." "Those aren't charges," Tolliver sneered. "Those are feelings." Kane bent, picked the ledger up from under the board like a man lifting a newborn who might bite. He blew ash from its edge. The wax over the seal, Tolliver's crest, bubbled. Jonah Pike's thumbprint lay fossilized in it. Kane swallowed smoke, and the memory of a boy who had once sealed letters with jam. The page he opened cut him from the eyes down. Night of Ash, D to SL. Make an example at the sheriff's place. Paid double. Underneath a tidy quandary. Eli's clumsy hand had added a final line in a margin where he probably thought the dark would hide it. Debt forgiven in exchange for silence. H.T. Horace Tolliver, the judge who sold the noose and the verdict it would deliver. Kane lifted his head. "You did it neat, Judge," he said, voice flat as a board. "Paid a man's debt to buy his tongue, then paid for rope to tie his hands." Tolliver tried for scorn, found spit. "You going to hang me on my own floor, Sheriff? Seems poetic." Kane's gaze cut to the broken beam, the noose lying in splinters like a dead snake. He tasted the old urge that ran hot as whiskey. He saw Anna's hand burned black across the stairs. He felt his boy's weight slick in his arms. He could have taken one step, fired one shot, and ended a chapter. Justice would have looked like vengeance and worn the same coat in that light. "Law ain't always justice," he said. The room held its breath, but justice rides with me. He holstered the Colt. Gasps ticked across pews. Lila's chin lifted an inch. Holt's mouth fell open, and then firmed like a knot pulled tight. Lark's eyes flashed. Not confusion, not disappointment. Something older, recognition. Widow Avery let out a breath like a prayer unclenched. Kane spoke to the room, not to the men at his feet. "You'll bear witness. We'll march them past the gallows and into the jail. We'll sign the book. We'll wire Santa Lucia and San Miguel and every court that still remembers what a gavel is for. We'll live with the fallout like honest men live with weather." Deacon laughed once, too loud. "You're betting on a system I own, Sheriff." "I'm betting on daylight," Kane said, "and on people who are done letting you collect night candles." He nodded at the blacksmith. "Chain 'em." The irons went on with practical clicks. The blacksmith's big hands did their work like they were setting shoes on devils. Lawton whimpered. Tolliver hissed. Deacon's eyes stayed bright and cold, taking impressions of every face in the room. There would be letters. There would be riders. This wasn't a last page, so much as a chapter crease. Outside, dawn began to lean in, thin and tin bright. The courthouse smoke glowed sallow as the first light found it. They brought the prisoners to their feet. Lark helped Widow Avery stand, then gripped Kane's sleeve. "You could have killed them," she said. "Simple. Not a complaint. A measure." "I do enough killing to last 3 lives," he answered. "I mean to spend the next one proving a different thing." On the steps, Kane stopped. The gallows shadow lay broken across the square. Beside it, in scuffed dust, lay something small and bright, the badge he'd dropped at high noon. He stood over it. The town stood with him. "Pick it up, Sheriff," Mrs. Talley called, voice trembling with a kind of stubborn love. "We got babies need sleeping without nightmares." He crouched. His thumb brushed the star's face. He felt the cool bite of metal, and the way it remembered the warm press of his palm. He didn't pin it yet. He walked the line between gallows and jail, prisoners before him, townsfolk at his back. Holt carried the ledger like a Bible, both hands, careful as a man carrying a newborn, and his own conscience at once. At the jailhouse door, Kane turned to the town. "You want spectacle," he said. "Here's mine." He lifted the badge, didn't hide what it meant, and pinned it back where the coat's dust had grown used to covering bare cloth. "We ain't better than our paper, and we ain't worse than our rope," he told them. "We'll use both right." A murmur went through them that tasted like the first honest drink after a thirsty day. The prisoners went into cells that smelled of iron, and lies finally cornered. Holt turned the key. It clicked home with a sound that felt like winter breaking. Kane stepped back into the light. The sun cut across his scar and found his eyes. Far on the ridge, a smear of dust showed riders coming. News, law, vengeance, maybe all three. He squared his shoulders to meet them. Beside him, Lark stood easy, chain coiled at her waist like a captured snake. Lila shaded her eyes with a ledger clerk's hand and watched the horizon with him. "You did right by him," Widow Avery said at his shoulder. "Eli, you could have damned him. You showed where the chain started." Kane's jaw worked. He looked at the churchyard beyond the square, where 2 stones waited for a man's words to catch up to his grief. He touched his badge and let it spin once, catching the newborn sun. "Reckon I did right by what was left of both of us," he said. A breeze came through and sent the nooses cut end swaying. A dead thing still trying to remember the dance it loved. Nothing in the square moved for a while but dust and breath. Then the telegraph clacked from inside the office. Fast. Urgent. Holt looked to Kane. Kane nodded. They stepped toward whatever message the wire carried from the larger world. Whether it would be justice or a new kind of damnation, Kane held himself ready to ride toward it. The courthouse still smelled of burnt paper days later. When wind shifted, Cedar Bluff tasted ink and ash and remembered who paid for gallows and who stood under them. Kane carried both scents inside him. He'd had his hand around vengeance and opened it. The choice left grooves in his palm where the metal might have been. He buried Eli twice, first in dust, then in truth, and spared the man the easy lie of villainy. The ledger did what his gun never could. It traced the rope back to the men who sold it by the yard. Yet justice, the kind he chose, moved slower than hate. It required daylight, signatures, witnesses willing to keep their courage after the smoke cleared. He pinned the badge again, not because the star made him whole, but because it made him answerable. Every time he felt its weight, he remembered the moment the town watched him put it back on, and he remembered saying yes to the harder road. In the quiet hours, he still fingers the pearl grip and asks which man he is, executioner or savior. But the answer isn't in the Colt. It is in the ledgers he refuses to burn, in the girls he refuses to abandon, in the gallows he refuses to feed. He knows what rides with him now, justice and the cost of it.